Welcome back to another vintage fishing reel or vintage fishing video. This one's going to be a little bit different than most of what I have on my vintage fishing playlist. Rather than being about servicing or repairing a vintage fishing reel or a vintage spin casting reel, this is going to be sort of a belated introduction to that portion of the channel. And so the title is Spincast Fishing, The Journey Home. In other words, the journey back to kind of the fishing gear that most of us fished with as kids. And so very few of us, when we started fishing, when we were handed our first fishing outfit, very few, I can't imagine very many at all, started with a spinning reel. Most of us started with some kind of spin cast outfit, or what's commonly called a close-faced. And in my case, it was something that looked exactly like this. This is a early to mid 70s Zebco 77 spin cast reel, where the reel is sort of part of the rod. And I wish I had my original one. I was able to retain it until I suspect sometime in my teens, maybe a little later, maybe 20s. And, when you're young like that, between 20 and years old and 10 years old or 5 years old isn't that much time. And so you don't have the same sentimentality and nostalgia, and so you think, oh, this old crappy kids reel, rod reel, getting beat up, and it ends up getting tossed. And that's probably what ultimately happened to mine. So recently, as the story will go, I've had a bout of nostalgia and started getting into some of these old things, including the ones just like my very first one. So I got my first one of these new probably around 1975, 4 or 5, and eventually, probably within a year or two, I think I upgraded to a Zebco 76. It's hard to remember. I know I got one that was separate from the rod, and it seemed to be gray and black, which would suggest at that time a 76, a Zebco 76, but it could have been a 101 or a 202 or something like that. Now my dad had this very reel. So this is a 70s, late 60s or 70s, I think, Mitchell 300. And it's quite frankly lucky that even this one survived, because he gave it to me a long time ago, recently passed away. But even before he passed away, I knew it was going to be special. I knew it was special, it was going to be special. But in my younger years, this went saltwater fishing and kind of got beat up and hadn't been serviced in ages. And the salt water had, bubbled all the paint off, and there was some corrosion. And so I did a full restoration on this one, repaint and the whole works, full service and maintenance. So, but I'm just really happy that made it to a point in my life where I, appreciated it more. And so, but that's what my dad had. But I got to watching fishing shows, and of course, I stayed with Spincast until probably the early 80s, and but then I got to watching these fishing shows on TV, Roland Martin and Bill Dance, and then you start getting into the mid 80s, and you've got your in fisherman specials and so on. And of course, as you watch those, all you saw, not only in terms of what the hosts of these shows were using, but the commercials seemed like they were all spinning spinning outfits with maybe some of the quote-unquote newer generation low-profile bait casters. And so that was, in your mind, whether it was justified or not, whether, in other words, that spinning is just infinitely better than spin casting, whether that was justified or not, seemed to have become part of the fishing culture. That seemed to relegate spin cast reels to kids and amateurs. And that sort of seems to have been the idea, and quite frankly still is, when you see some of the memes and stuff that are out there, that only serious fishermen use spinning reels and bait casters. Everything else is for amateurs and kids. Now, some of the old timers weren't influenced by that culture, that cultural pressure. I remember when I was a kid, I would take my Zebco 77. I was about 5 years old, and I'd actually get up early in the morning, and we lived on a lake, and I'd walk down to the pier, our own pier on our property, and I'd look down to my right, down the shoreline to my right, where all the piers of all the other homeowners were. And at the end of each of those piers was an old man with a fishing pole and either a minute bucket or a coffee can full of worms. And I'd look to my left and I'd see the same thing. And I would be like the only kid out there. And there we would fish. And most of those guys had spin cast rods, old Zebco 33s, the good old spin cast rods. But, as the 80s came around, I sort of succumbed to the idea that you weren't basically a serious fisherman unless you were fishing with a spinning outfit or one of the new generation bait casters. So I saved up my money, and I don't still have it. For reasons you'll learn, it got tossed pretty quickly, but I saved up allowance money and bought up my first ever spinning reel, which wasn't a good one like this. It ended up being a cheap Daiwa spinning reel. And it broke or failed. I don't remember exactly what happened. I just know that it wasn't due to negligence or something on my part. It was just cheap and broke. I had hardly touched it or used it. And although it may not be fair to the manufacturer, to this day, I have never bought another Daiwa product. I was just so devastated. So that was the end of that reel and Daiwa in my fishing history. But sometime in the 80s, this would have been, these things date to, I think, like 81 to 84, somewhere in there. I ended up getting, I don't think I bought this new. I think this was a trade. But I got this Zebco 6010. And I used this for quite a while. And this thing it is now, because I've gone through and serviced it, but that thing is just as smooth as silk. It's a really nice reel, built like a tank. Now at some point this pin came out, and of course I was just a kid, and as a result of that, I put I don't know, it was a piece of clothes hanger or fence wire or something in there to get that reel handle back on. And I later fixed that and put an actual pin in there once I realized what kind of pin was supposed to go in there, these little compression pins. But by that point, I had I started to get a part-time job, which allowed me to buy my own new spinning reels, etc., or buy used ones from people that had them for sale. But until a few years ago, almost all of my fishing outfits were spinning reels, with the exception of this 1981 Abu Garcia 5000 bait caster, which I just recently did a video on the repair of that. And then I had, this one was the first bait caster I bought new. That's a Shimano Bantam B-Mag 1000, kind of one of those low profile with the magnet for slowing the spool and this and that. And so I got one of those. And then I had of course, some saltwater bait casters and that kind of thing. And I was sufficiently self-aware to realize that I had basically become a spinning reel snob. Until recently, it's still out there. I have a whole wall of spinning reels, and that was all I had or used. And then, of course, I had some bait casters for saltwater and that kind of thing. But I had become one of the spinning reel snobs, and probably, I know for sure, passed judgment when I saw someone fishing with a spin cast reel. I'd mumble under my breath, look at that Mickey Mouse outfit, and kind of chuckle. But one day I was organizing the corner of my workshop that was devoted to fishing gear, pegboard and fishing rods, and I've got shelves for the tackle boxes and so on. And I found an old tackle box with reels that I had decommissioned in there, or that for some reason had sentimental value. And this was one of them. And that brings back some memories. And then there were a couple others in there that weren't initially mine. One was this beautiful, not even faded. I mean, this is a really nice Zebco 808 from 1967. And I know where this one came from. This one's got, kind of got a fascinating ownership. This one was owned by Dr. Elton Anthony Lindsay, who passed away in late 1999, like December of 99. But at the time he gave it to me until his death, he was the oldest surviving member of the bird polar research expeditions to Antarctica. And Lindsay had 7 islands named after him in that area of the world, called the Lindsay Islands. Was the first managing editor of 2 very important and scientific journals, and wrote a number of books, and on and on and on and on. And he gave me, he became a friend of mine, and he gave me that reel. So that one, I don't know the extent to which I'll use that one much, just because of the historical aspect. And then there's one in there, I don't remember where the heck I got it. Maybe it was another gift, maybe it came from Lindsay also, I just don't remember. But this 1968 Zebco 33. And I started looking at that thing and feeling, the weight of it, and it's all metal, and boy, did that kind of strike a chord of nostalgia with me. And I thought, you know what, I love to restore things. Restore antique tractors and all kinds of stuff. I just like making things shine and look and work like new again. So I decided I'm going to clean that up. And maybe I'm gonna, I started looking at the, quality of materials and the gears and the brass and so on. I'd like to just, just go out and go fish with a, by God, closed face spinning reel and just go out and have some fun. And when I did that, I had forgotten how effortless and fun it is to cast a properly maintained and a properly spooled spin cast reel. So at any rate, it also then, of course, reminded me of my trusty old 77 that I once had. And so that sort of nostalgia led to my saying, you know what, I gotta find, I didn't even know the extent to which good preserved ones were even available. So I started going around to antique malls that were known to have fishing equipment, and and swap meets and this kind of thing. And by God, if I didn't find one, it was this one here, and I got that. And after that, I started buying every one I saw. So I don't have a ton of them, but I've got quite a little collection of them of that same style throughout more than a decade of them. So as many of you that follow the channel know, I clean and repair and service and restore these things, and I find it very therapeutic. I find that aspect of what has become a hobby quite therapeutic. And it's, when I started doing it, I thought, well, because I've looked at other videos too. Before I get into a reel, the first thing I do is start researching it, research when it was made and this and that. And if I'm a little uncomfortable with what might be inside, like if it's a bait caster or something like that, or some weird configuration of a Spincast, I'll get on YouTube and look at other videos that people have done to see what's in there. And before I get into it. And that's why I've always said, if I make a mistake or something, or do something wrong, or at least there's a video out there showing what's inside, so you know what to expect. I mean, I may not always do videos without mistakes, but it's valuable just showing what's inside for somebody. But I started fishing with my old 77 and the 33s, and just started having a lot of fun. And it added a whole new element to fishing. And I started collecting not just Zebcos. I started out with just collecting Zebcos, which are near and dear to my heart. But then I started getting interested in some of the other oddball and neat-looking Spincast reels. And so fishing with these old friends added a whole new element to fishing. Because I've always said fishing is more than just catching fish. There's more to fishing than just catching fish. It's maybe more than 50% is just the experience, whether you catch anything or not. I don't usually fish to keep fish. I just mostly catch and release. But now I've got reels that span decades, and this is by no means all of them. These are just a few examples that I mentioned in this history, but I've got quite a collection now, and including the contemporaneous vintage rods that go with them. That's part of the collecting. I want the original rods that go with them. But now when I go out fishing, it's not just about where am I going to go, or what bait am I going to use, or even rod I'm going to use, but it might be more about, okay, what era would I like to fish today? Maybe I'd like to fish the 1930s and pull out one of the old style bait casters. Or maybe I want to fish the 1960s and only use rods and reels from the 60s. Or maybe it's my childhood in the 70s. So that's kind of a fun thing. It just adds a whole new element to fishing, is, kind of picking a decade and picking only rods and reels from that decade, and going out there and just enjoying yourself and having some nostalgia. So kind of a whole new hobby was born, collecting and vintage rods and reels, and part of that is the fun of going out in the field and finding good deals, swap meets, antique mall garage sales, that kind of thing. And then the other part is the fun of restoring them. There's just great satisfaction that comes from that. And then sharing in that, because none of these reels that I service on this channel are for sale. I don't do this to make money. I don't sell them. They're all just my personal reels that I decide, hey, I'm going to service this anyway. Might as well throw it on YouTube and share it. So at any rate, and with regard to rods, and there's certainly probably truth to it about the vintage rods being quote unquote whippy. Now, I don't know anything about action or taper or any of that. I'm just a blue collar, know enough to be dangerous type fisherman. But I do catch fish, rarely do I go fishing with anybody, regardless of their level of experience, and not take home, or not take home, but catch the most fish. So I can fish, but I've never really gotten into the whole science of rod taper and action. But I don't like fishing with telephone poles. I'm not on Bassmasters trying to, horse these fish in as quickly as I can and get them into a live well. I mean, the fun of fishing is the fight, and of course I like fishing with the vintage rods. Yeah, they're maybe a little whippy and this and that, and don't have this taper or that action, and so on and so forth. But I enjoy them, and so I fish generally smaller, light rods, and rarely fish with line over 8-pound tests. If I'm going catfishing or something, yeah, a little bit more. But if you know how to adjust the drag and how to fight the fish, you don't need piano wire for fishing line. In fact, I just saw a story just a couple days ago where some guy had a Zebco reel with 6-pound test on it and landed a 70-pound flathead catfish on it. It took over an hour to get the thing in, but he did it. So yeah, if I have light line and a whippy pole and the fish gets off, well, there you go. Had fun, and have a story about the one that got away. But like I said, I don't fish with telephone poles. Don't care if the rod's whippy or if it meets them, today's standards of sophistication. I just like to go out and fish, and I like to fight and feel the fish. So that's a little bit about my thoughts on using the vintage rods with the vintage reels. So that's kind of basically a little bit about my history and my journey home, because all those spinning rods that are hanging on the pegboard in my workshop haven't been touched in a couple of years. And now I've got 10 times more vintage fishing outfits, and that's all I ever use anymore. It's just been such a great experience, that new element of fishing, the ease and with which you cast these things. I was fishing with a buddy, kind of idling along the shore in a pontoon. I'm sitting in the captain's chair casting away, casting the shore. Buddy asks, how can you cast sitting down? Well, I don't know if it was the reel or not, but I suspect it was. Fishing with these old, simple, easy to cast push button reels, just a little less fatigue, in my opinion, than some of the other more modern outfits and spinning reels and so on and so forth. So that, again, is a little bit of an introduction of my journey home from Spincast reels to spinning reels and peer pressure, culture pressure, and finally making my way back home to my heritage as a kid, the Spincast reels. So hope you enjoyed that. There'll be more vintage fishing reel service and repair videos, and hopefully this summer some videos showing them in use. Thanks for watching.